Welcome back to Bridging of Ages. And today's topic, are generational divides real? Now, the concept of generations with specific names is really a relatively modern phenomenon. And societies have always had recognized different life stages, but we never put them into these 15 to 20-year blocks before. And that really comes, we had a collective identity in the 20th century invention, and some people wrote some books, and we came up with this concept that we're going to name our generations, and we're going to do these set 15 or 20-year blocks. Even though, if you think about it, within a 20-year block, you have very different experiences from those in the beginning to those at the end. For instance, if you're in your 40s or in your early 60s, and they still call you a particular generation, your differences are, your experiences are very different. Those two groups have very different experiences. So just to give you an example, with what we call the boomers. So the males of that generation were eligible for the draft for Vietnam. But people like myself who are within that same one were just a couple years too young, and we didn't have to deal with that. So when I went to camp, I had counselors who were at Woodstock, even though I was too young for it. My musical tastes are a little different than them. So within a generation, the differences can often be greater than the differences between them. And think about it, if you're on the cusp of one of those, you can't decide if you're in one or the other. So I know they like to draw the line somewhere, but in a way, think about it as an artificial barrier. They're really much more of a media or a marketing thing. So where do these names come from? So there are a couple guys, William Strauss and Neil Howe, wrote a book called Generations, and they created these 15 to 20 year age brackets. Even though many studies have shown that these divides are actually quite small when we look at them. I think you will find when you start talking to people that we actually have much more in common than we have what divide us just by these age labels. And so there's really not a lot of evidence there. So Dr. Eden King in Rice University studies workplace diversity and puts it very bluntly. This is a quote, generational differences at work are small. Thinking they're big affects our behavior. So this observation of these generations are actually what affect our behavior about them. We internalize them. We create these conflicts that we're actually trying to avoid. There's not a lot of really scientific consensus of these generations and when one ends and one begins. And the variance is actually very small. So the Pew Research Center did a study in 2017, and they found that the differences were very minimal. So why does these things persist? Part of it's convenience. Humans like to label things. We like to put things in boxes that help us think about them. Part of it's habit, because we've just gotten used to them. Part of it is it really helps with marketing and trying to sell things. So what is this really kind of fuels the conflict more than helping people work together? And the way I see it is this is where it intersects with ageism, because we start thinking of other people with different experiences and different ages as the other. And once we think of them as the other, we get into those isms. So we grab those stereotypes, but the reality can be completely different. So are we ready to challenge these stereotypes? Because if you think about it, ageism is something we're all going to eventually run into. It's the one ism that we're still tolerating, and we're not seeing each other as individuals. And when we focus on these arbitrary labels, we stop listening. One of the things I like to do is teach active listening. And what active listening is really listening to what the other person has to say. And why is that important? Because we usually listen waiting to jump in to say our piece. And if we're doing that, we're not listening to what that person is saying. So active listening actually helps facilitate two-way conversations. So just to give you a little idea of, I was on a consulting gig and I needed some assistance from this technical guy who was much younger than me. And I asked him for some help. And I didn't really think about his age. I thought about what can he help me with? And the interesting thing about it is I worked with him and he was brilliant, this guy. And he really helped me out and got my project moving forward. But one of the things when he was done, I said, "Thank you." And he looked at me kind of stunned. He goes, "I've been here for several years now, and you're the first manager that said thank you." I'm like, that made no sense to me. But he was discounted for being young, and they didn't think he knew anything. And he actually knew a lot and had a lot to offer. And the funny thing about it is nobody could understand why my projects always got the technical help first, because I treated this guy for what was in his head, not what age he was. So this is an example of, and we'll get into this more in subsequent shows, but this is really an idea of intergenerational teams that both sides can offer a lot. In the age discrimination we see out there a lot is a lot on the older end and a lot on the younger end. And they're discounted for who they are, for which label, which box. So we're really looking to move beyond these arbitrary generational labels. And we shouldn't assume just because you're in a particular group that you've been labeled that you have particular behaviors. I'm sure you've all heard it. Younger employees are entitled. Older employees are out of touch. They don't know how to do technology. And then these stereotypes become full self-fulfilling prophecies. But if you look at the studies, the science is clear. Generational divides are really largely a myth. And if you think about your own situation, what's really important is, are you your age, or are you more the collection of your experiences? So I was on a large project that I was managing, and I was the program project manager. And we were bringing up this project in over 100 countries around the world. And it was very important to the company that we were working with. And I had centers in Dubai and in Singapore and in Germany and in the US. And we branched out to do these kind of things. But what was really interesting is I was the oldest guy on the project. When I first came in, the assumption was made that I wouldn't understand the technologies that we were working with. The funny thing about it is I ended up teaching people half my age how to do the tech. But every person at every age had something to offer. And because we were able to talk to each other on a very personal basis and understand each other and mentor each other, the innovation just escalated. And we had a very successful project. And what I liked and what I found is that intergenerational teams have a strength that you can't find anywhere else. And it really has to do with the combination of experiences. And when we got away from the stereotypes of saying, oh, he's a boomer, he's a millennial, he's a Gen Z, he's Gen X, when we got away from those labels that are very artificial, we were able to work together. Now, granted, the communication sometimes can be different, the communication styles can be different, but we can adapt and we can learn from each other. Because if we come in assuming on these artificial levels, we are not going to be able to move it forward because we get stuck. It's like any kind of conscious or unconscious prejudice that you have. You make an assumption without having the facts. So since, it looks like the differences are even more so within these blocks than between them, perhaps we should think about getting rid of these artificial labels. And that's going to be hard because they're pervasive everywhere. And I even find myself, I have to catch myself at times and go, oh, you were thinking as a label, not as what that person could offer. So it's really quite important that we start to think about, are these generational divides real? Or are they just a perception because we've been taught that those in different age groups are the other? And we fear the other. So if you think about the fact that anybody who is 20 years older than you or 20 years younger than you can't understand what you have to say, well, look at their combination of experiences. Of course, we're going to know different music. We formulated that when we were younger. We're going to read different things. We're going to be into different social media. We're going to have a different approach to technology. But overall, we will find that we can meld that and use it. Because if you keep these artificial barriers, we don't allow ourselves to think differently. And one of the things you'll find in subsequent shows is we're going to examine each piece of this. And we're going to look at it. And we're going to have people come on who are going to have experiences with this and help us understand and learn better. So don't rely on generational labels. Think about it as not being what the person really is. People are not their age. Watch out for the stereotypes. Don't blame the other. Look at internally how you're thinking about it. And if you are open to that communication and to learning from people older and younger than yourself, I think you will find that you'll grow much more. So I'd like to give you some action items, but before we do that, why don't we have a word from our sponsor? And when we come back, we'll talk about some of the action items that you can do and think about to help you. Back to Bridge Builder Bits on Bridging of Ages. Today we talk about talent. We walk past the talent every day, and then we turn around and say, we can't find any talent. How are we excluding it? Because of conscious or unconscious bias. We are not looking at talent that is right in front of us. We walk right by it. Whether it could be because they're too young, they're too old, or don't meet that perfect purple squirrel that we're trying to look for. We walk past talent every day. Don't walk past the talent. It's right in front of you. This has been another Bridge Builder Bits on Bridging of Ages. Welcome back. Let's take a look together at some action items. We're going to look for a way to bridge the gap with some actionable steps. Now, we talked about these artificial labels, boomer, millennial, Gen Z, these arbitrary time blocks of 15 to 20 years. They even have a generation alpha now because they started at the end of the alphabet and now they have to go back around. So we're going to work our way through the Greek alphabet now. And these kids were just born starting in 2025. And they've already assigned the characteristics of what they are going to be, even though they're still infants. So it kind of shows you the silliness of these labels. But they stick. You know, we saw how people are treating each other with ageist stereotypes and how that's counterproductive and how it divides us. And then we looked at a little bit of how it's not as wide a difference as it seems. And especially people who are on this artificial cusp, where do they belong? So the labels are really very inaccurate. But what are we going to do about it? Because they're everywhere. We can't make them disappear overnight. They're embedded in our culture, in our workplace, in our media, in our marketing, and frankly, our own thinking. As I said, I fall into the trap myself sometimes, even though I have an awareness around it. And awareness is really the first step towards change. So you have to actively challenge your unconscious and conscious bias. And that can be hard at times. So let's take a look at the first action. So I call it the 48-hour generational language audit. And what does that mean? So for the next 48 hours, I want you to become hyper aware of the generational language both you and others are using around you. And note the language and how it's utilized. And note how it's accepted without evidence or comment. And then think about how you would rephrase it and move away and how you would talk and explain the other person without the ageist label. So that's pick a 48-hour, 2-day period and try to do that generational language audit on yourself. Action item number 2. I call this the individual discovery protocol. And this is where we're going to move from awareness that we had in the first step to action. So start a generational dialogue. Instead of making things up about the other person, start talking to people at different ages. Move away from the assumptions and look what motivates each person and how their experiences shape them. And then work on changing your own language. Initiate intentional intergenerational connections. So get away from those labels and really make a concerted effort over the next week to talk to someone older or younger than yourself or both. And I think you will find a lot more in common than you find different. So you're now moving into action and ways to change that behavior. Action item 3. Focus on skills and qualities, not birth years. Because remember, those birth years go into those labels. So notice when you're doing age-related assumptions on both yourself and on others. And think about the difference in experiences, not age. Challenge your age-based assumptions in your daily life. And think about how you can learn from each other. And start to move away from those artificial barriers and those artificial labels. So, once again, our action items are the 48-hour generalist language audit, where you're looking at the language you use, the individual discovery protocol, so you're looking within yourself and starting to make changes, and the focus on skills and qualities, not birth years. So you're now starting to move away from these artificial labels that are pervasive everywhere. So take these action items, and I have one more for you. Now, this is the tip of the day for you. So use the individual first mental model. And what does that mean? Think about the individual, not the group or label that you think they're in. Remember when I told you a story? I was the oldest person on the team, and the assumption was that I could have trouble with technology, and then I ended up teaching everybody else. There's an example. The assumption was made. It didn't follow like that. And I ended up being the one teaching others. And that young man who was discounted for being young and never told he was doing well and never thanked, because he was the youngest, one of the youngest ones there, and they just assumed what his skills were. So when you're meeting someone new or trying to understand try to understand their different perspective. You do this a lot in your daily life, but sometimes it gets lost when we're talking about ages. And we don't want to fall into ageism. Instead of thinking or asking, what generation are you from? Try asking them, what has been your experience? Because people are really a collection of their experience, not the labels we put on them. And before every interaction, check yourself with a colleague, a customer, a team member, a friend, somebody you just meet, standing in line at the grocery store. Remind yourself, a very special thing about them has nothing to do with their age. Then you too can be part of bridging of ages. So to recap that, remember the individual first. That's really the most powerful. Because if we treat each other as individuals and not as a label as part of the group, we've now taken the step to move away from thinking that these labels are really real. So when we ask, are generational divides real? By your experience and trying these action items and the tip of the day, I think you will find that they aren't real. And we will be talking about the various pieces of this as we go on through the different shows. So today on Bridging of Ages, the topic we discussed is, are generational divides real? And I think you will find that they really aren't. Next time on Bridging of Ages, we're going to continue the discussion with the topic of intergenerational dialogue and explore how we talk to each other with different experience levels. So I'd like you to please subscribe to my YouTube channel. You'll see the QR code in the corner. I am Dan Mendelevitz. We look forward to you joining us again on the next Bridging of Ages.